This project is going to be an introduction into creating a value scale and different types of mark making with graphite. We're going to start off by folding our paper in half. On one half, we're going to do value scales and mark making. The other half, we're going to apply those onto a sphere. You're going to be starting by making 5 squares on the left-hand side of this page. In this point, we're going to be putting different mark making techniques without any value included in them. It's just going to be a middle tone, so not very dark, not very light. Next to them, we're going to be drawing 5 rectangles. In those rectangles, that is where we're going to include our wide range of values, from dark to light. To help us identify the different values, we are going to label them. We're going to start by placing a 1 on the left-hand side, 5 on the right-hand side, a 3 in the middle, and we're going to fill that in with a 2 and a 4. Just so we have a scale from 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. 1 is going to be the lightest, 5 is going to be the darkest, 2, 3, and 4 are going to be those middle shades. We're doing that to every single rectangle because we are going to include value on every single rectangle in this project. We're going to start in our top square with blending. So blending is done by using the side of your pencil, typically. This creates an even tone. We're just going to do a middle tone in this square. So to create a middle tone, you don't press down really hard or really light, just something in between. When you press down really hard, that'll create a darker shade, and when you press down really light, that will create a lighter shade. That's what we're doing with our first rectangle. I'm starting in 5, but you can see that's not really dark, because a thing that will help when thinking of blending with graphite is that you can always go back and make something darker if you need to, but it's harder to make it lighter. So as I transition down my rectangle, I'm using lighter and lighter pressure. My pencil is not nearly as heavy on the page. And then I can go back and revisit, and I can make some areas darker if need be, which my 5 did need to be a little bit darker. It was a little bit too light. It looked more like a middle tone. I'm making very tiny circular motions, so close that you can barely tell that they're happening. It's not like a zigzag, they're very tiny circular motions, and I can show you that again if you are having a hard time with that concept. I'm just making sure at this point now that I have a smooth transition from my dark shades to my light shades. I can go over those areas of transition, so where it transitions from 5 to 4, 4 to 3, and just add a really, really light shade over that area of transition. That will help even that and make it look a little bit smoother and a little bit more blended. Using blending and shading in general, it's just always revisiting and adding layers and dealing with your pressure, and this is something that will get better with time. Our second one that we're doing is hatching. Hatching is done by making lines in one direction. This is not scribbling, it is not going back and forth, it is making lines in one direction. So to create a darker shade, we make our lines closer together and we use heavier pressure. As I get farther down my value scale, I'm going to lighten up the pressure on my pencil. I'm not pushing down nearly as hard. And I am also trying to make the lines farther apart from one another. The closer they are, the darker it'll look. The farther they are from one another, the lighter it will look. Just like with blending, if I see that an area needs to be a little bit darker, I can always go back and make that darker. It's nice to start it in a middle tone and then go back and revisit areas if it does need to be a little bit different than it was. Again, with this one, you're also paying attention to those areas of transition. I'm going back to that area, adding some more lines, adding some lines in a slight bit direction to kind of break up that space a little bit more. After hatching comes cross-hatching. So cross-hatching is completed by making lines just like we did for hatching. They're all going in the same direction. And then you're going to make crosses. You're going to go the opposite direction. With cross-hatching, you just don't need to go 2 different diagonals. You can include some horizontal lines and some vertical lines in there too to help create a darker value. You're starting off just like we did with hatching, going in with lines of one direction. Not the band, just putting your lines in the same direction as one another. And then once all of that is completed, you can see I'm kind of following that same step as before, lightening up, putting my lines farther apart from one another to create that value. Then you can go back and then you can add lines in a different direction. Again, you don't have to stick to the same direction. They can go any which way. Realistically, when you're applying this to something, your lines are going to match the direction and the angles of the object that you are shading in. This one, as long as they are crossing one another, you are being successful. To create more values, layer, pressure, it will get a bit repetitive, but those are the main tips that I have for when you are using graphite. Our next method of shading is going to be scumbling. It is fancy, precise scribbling, but it is not scribbling, it is scumbling. Basically, the way that I like to think of scumbling is that it looks like cursive, except like doctor's cursive, like you can't understand what it is. You still have the lines, you still have some swoops, it's still very random, but you're not doing actual letters. So I'm starting on my darker end, starting at the level 5, making my lines closer together. As I transition down, they're going to get farther apart and my pressure is going to get lighter. To create darker values, you're just going to be overlapping your scumbling technique, revisiting a lot, making them a little bit closer together, but you still want that texture. So the scumbling method is used so much to create texture, whether it is hair, like curly hair, or whether it is leaves in a tree or bushes. Anything that has that fluffy texture to it, you will use scumbling. Our last value of the bunch is going to be tick hatching. So this is the most repetitive and it also takes the longest, but it looks really cool when it's done. You create it by making tiny little marks, and these are very, very tiny. It kind of looks like hatching or cross hatching, but the way that you create value is by including so many of these tiny little marks close to one another that it appears to be dark. This is very good for using texture, just like I mentioned with scumbling. This one looks a lot more like beard hair to me. It just looks very hairy in texture. But when it's completed in the masses, it looks very cool. So to create that darker value, you just have a lot of them. You have them very close together. As you get farther down your value scale, they're going to get farther apart and a whole lot lighter. Pressure plays a little bit of a part into this one too. So again, for 5, you're using heavy pressure. As you go down the line, you lighten it up. But when you get to 1, I still want you to include some tick hatching, just because even if it is a highlighted area, it's nice to have a little bit of substance still there so you can tell it is still a part of your mark making technique. A lot again with this one is going back, adding more layers, darkening it up as you go. Start out light and then you can make it darker as you progress. So that is how we create different types of value with mark making. So now we're going to apply this in part 2 to a sphere, where we're going to be doing the blending technique.